You guys are going to be reading a really interesting short story called The Most Dangerous Game. And you can just tell by looking at the cover, what with the skull and the big knife or dagger and the dark background and kind of the jungle stuff going on the left side of the picture there. There's probably going to be a lot of mysterious stuff going on. As you get into this story, you might begin to notice something rather peculiar in that there's certain things that happen in this story that might remind you a lot of the Hunger Games. Now, you may have read that book recently or seen that movie. And the Hunger Games is not the same story as The Most Dangerous Game, but I think you're going to see some rather interesting connections between the two. What's kind of fascinating is the Hunger Games was written not too long ago, whereas The Most Dangerous Game was written almost 100 years ago. So to kind of give you a little background on what's going on in history, back when this story was written, we're going to take a look at a timeline here. And so this timeline sort of ranges from 1850 to 2000 and beyond. And of course, we're in beyond now. So at this point in time, here we are on this timeline. And so the chances are it's pretty likely that you were born sometime around the year 2000, give or take a few years. It might have been earlier, a little bit later than 2000, but sometime around that area. And of course, this is the era of iPhones and tablets and things of that nature. So given the starting point, if you go back in time a little ways, back to 1975, that was probably about the time when your parents were born. Now, they may not have been born exactly in 1975, but just generally in that era is probably when they were born. And if you push back even further, all the way back to 1950, that's probably about the time when your grandparents were born. If we push back even further, all the way back to 1925, that's probably about the time when your great-grandparents were born. So what was going on in history during this time? Well, one of the big events was World War II, which was between 1939 and 1945. And of course, that's when the English, Great Britain, France, the United States, and a number of other countries were, as allies, were fighting against the Nazis in Germany and the Japanese. And of course, that was a pretty horrendous war. About 50 million people died during that war. If we push back a little bit further in time was when World War I occurred, which was back in 1914 through 18. That was a pretty horrendous war as well. And again, there were a number of countries fighting as allies against the Germans. And that was the war when airplanes first came into play as weapons, as well as when tanks were invented and things of that nature. So if we push back, way back in time, that was back when the U.S. Civil War occurred. We're going to take a look at when The Most Dangerous Game was first published. Now, that was in 1924, which was about halfway between World War I and World War II, probably about the time when your great-grandparents were born. So what was going on during that period of time? Well, and what's that got to do with the Most Dangerous Game? Well, to give you a little background, there was a country at that time called Russia. You probably heard of Russia because there's a country now also called Russia. It's basically the same place. And at that time, back in before World War I, it was ruled by a fellow named Nicholas II. And he was the Tsar, or otherwise known as the Emperor of Russia. Also, these are similar to kings and people like that. And so the Tsar and other people in the ruling class at the time lived really well. So for example, the Tsar had fabulous palaces where there was gold everywhere and so forth. And not only did he have one huge palace, he had several huge palaces. So this guy living really well, as did most of the people in the ruling class at that time. So at the same time, these guys are living extremely well. You also had the Russian peasants, which were really poor people, and there were hundreds of thousands of peasants. And so obviously they're not living so well. They're out trying to make a living, farming. A lot of them are starving. They can barely put food in their children's mouths. It's a really tough life to be a Russian peasant, well, especially at the same time when the Tsar is living so well. So this is what was kind of going on in Russia at the time when World War I broke out. And so when World War I started, the Russians got involved. So the Tsar sent his armies off to fight in World War I. Unfortunately, the Germans really kicked their butt, in essence. In other words, many thousands of Russian soldiers were captured by the Germans. Many more thousands were killed or severely wounded. Those that survived sort of limped home back to Russia. And so you've got a czar now who's incredibly unpopular because he made some very bad decisions about fighting in World War I. And at the same time, you have all these Russian peasants that are really starving and hungry and so forth. And so what happened about that time was the Russian Revolution started. And this was basically an attempt, a very successful attempt to overthrow the ruling class and the existing government and basically put the Tsar out of business. So this is when Lenin became the leader of the revolution. And one of the things that happened as part of this revolution was that the Tsar Nicholas II had some beautiful daughters and a wife, and he also had a young prince son. Unfortunately, they were all executed because that was the revolutionaries' way of getting rid of the ruling class. So basically, these guys are gone. And in fact, if you had any connections at all with the Tsar or the ruling class in Russia, it was really a bad place to be because you didn't want to get executed like the Tsar and his family were executed. And a lot of people died during the Russian Revolution. It was pretty violent. That is, a lot of people were trying to get out of Russia because they didn't want to be executed like the Tsar's family. And one of those fellows wound up in the Caribbean, and that's where this story takes place. So the Caribbean, as you know, is down sort of halfway between the United States and South America. And there's an island in the Caribbean where this story takes place. It's a long ways from Russia. So the story doesn't actually take place in Russia. It's just about somebody who left Russia because he was connected to the Tsar, was trying to get out of town, and he ended up in the Caribbean islands. Now, when you think of the Caribbean today, you probably think of resorts and cruise ships and beautiful white beaches and big umbrellas and people laying out, having drinks and sunning on the beach and so forth. Back in 1924, while there were certainly lots of people living in the Caribbean, it was nothing like the Caribbean you know today. It was very tropical and a very mysterious and exotic place to visit. And that's where this story takes place.